In the chaos of the First World War, there were countless stories of courage, soldiers who held the line, medics who saved lives under fire, and leaders who refused to give up. But among the mud, the gunfire, and the noise of artillery, there was one hero who stood out, a small, battered bird that carried a message through gunfire and smoke, and changed the fate of hundreds of men. That hero was Cher Ami, a messenger pigeon of the U.S. Army Signal Corps whose flight became one of the most famous moments of World War I. By the fall of 1918, the war was nearing its end, but nobody on the front could feel it. In northeastern France, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive had begun, one of the largest and bloodiest operations ever launched by American forces. Over 1 million U.S. troops were involved, pushing through dense forests, ravines, and German defenses that had been strengthened for years. The American 77th Infantry Division, composed largely of men from New York, was part of that assault. In early October 1918, elements of this division, under Major Charles W. Whittlesey, advanced deep into the Argonne forest. They moved so far forward that they didn't realize their flanks had not kept up. Within hours, they were completely surrounded by German troops. Cut off from communication and supply, nearly 550 men were trapped in a narrow ravine near the Charlevoix mill. It was steep, wooded terrain filled with mud, fallen trees, and shell craters. And now they were the lost battalion. The men had little food, almost no water, and no medical supplies. German snipers watched their every move. Runners sent to deliver messages were captured or killed. Even worse, American artillery batteries behind the lines didn't know where Whittlesey's men were, and they began shelling the very area the 77th was holding. Every explosion came from friendly guns. The soldiers had to dig shallow holes for cover as shells burst around them. Communication lines were cut, radios were useless, and time was running out. The only hope left for contact was an old-fashioned one: carrier pigeons. During the First World War, pigeons were still one of the most reliable means of battlefield communication. Radios were new, bulky, and fragile. Telegraph wires were easily destroyed by shelling. A well-trained homing pigeon could fly 40 to 60 miles per hour and cover up to 100 miles in a single flight, carrying tiny message tubes attached to their legs. The U.S. Army Signal Corps trained thousands of them, and they had saved lives more than once. Each battalion kept a small mobile loft, a wooden structure where the pigeons lived and trained, and every bird was tagged and tracked by number. It was dangerous work. Many pigeons never made it back. Gunners on both sides shot them down deliberately to prevent messages from getting through. Still, they were trusted. When all else failed, a pigeon might succeed. On October 4th, 1918, after days of constant fighting and friendly fire raining down, Major Whittlesey made a desperate decision. With no other way to reach headquarters, he turned to the few pigeons left alive. Several birds had already been released earlier that day, and none returned. Finally, they prepared their last bird, Cher Ami, French for dear friend. Whittlesey dictated a short, urgent message. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The note was written on thin message paper, rolled, and placed in a small aluminum tube tied to the bird's leg. Soldiers stepped out from the shelter of trees, holding the bird and shaking hands. Machine gun fire echoed through the forest, As soon as they released her, German troops opened fire. Cher Ami took off, her gray wings cutting through the smoke. She rose through rifle fire, explosions, and shrapnel. Within seconds, soldiers saw feathers fall. She had been hit. For a moment, it looked like she would drop from the sky, but somehow she kept going. The wounded flight, Cher Ami's flight, covered roughly 25 miles through active combat zones. Witnesses later reported that she was shot through the breast and that one of her legs was almost completely torn off. The small aluminum message tube hung from the remaining tendons of her leg. Despite the wounds, she didn't turn back. She made it all the way to the division's loft, barely alive. When handlers found her, she was bleeding, one eye destroyed, her leg hanging by a thread. But the message was still there. The moment the note was read, officers scrambled to stop the artillery barrage. The coordinates were corrected. The shelling stopped. That single flight had saved the remaining men of the lost battalion. Of the roughly 550 who had gone in, about 194 survived to walk out after the relief arrived. Many credited their survival to that last message carried by Cher Ami. When word spread of what had happened, Cher Ami became an instant legend among the Signal Corps. Army medics worked to save her life. They managed to patch up her wounds, and though she lost the leg, she survived. Her story was told across newspapers back home. To a war-weary public, the story of a tiny bird braving machine gun fire to save American soldiers was irresistible, a symbol of courage and loyalty in a war that had seen so much loss. Cher Ami was officially credited with saving the lives of the trapped soldiers of the 77th Division. She was awarded the French Croix de Guerre with Palm for heroic service, a decoration given to those who distinguished themselves through acts of bravery. When the war ended, the U.S. Army brought her home in 1919. She lived out the rest of her days in the care of the Signal Corps, honored and remembered by the soldiers she had helped save. Unfortunately, she never fully recovered from her injuries. She died on June 13, 1919. After her death, Cher Ami's body was preserved and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Today, she's one of the museum's most famous animal artifacts, displayed in the National Museum of American History. Visitors can still see the damaged leg, the scar on her breast, and the message tube that once carried those desperate words. The Smithsonian notes that Cher Ami became part of public memory almost immediately after the war. For many Americans, she represented not only the sacrifice of soldiers, but the overlooked contributions of animals in warfare, from horses and mules to dogs and pigeons. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, her story appeared in children's books, school readers, and even stage performances. She was cited in newspapers and radio shows as an example of bravery and loyalty. Her name became synonymous with courage. To understand why Cher Ami's story mattered so much, it helps to realize how vital pigeons were during the First World War. Across Europe, all major armies used messenger pigeons: France, Britain, Germany, and the U.S. Each side employed tens of thousands of birds. The British Army maintained entire pigeon service units. The French even trained them aboard tanks. Pigeons were fast, reliable, and didn't depend on wires or power. Some reports estimate that during the war, pigeons delivered more than 100,000 crucial messages for Allied forces, many under enemy fire. In the U.S. Signal Corps alone, Records show that about 90% of messages sent by pigeons arrived successfully. Some pigeons were decorated for bravery, others remembered only by their serial numbers. Cher Ami, however, became the face of them all, the one whose name everyone remembered. The story of the Lost Battalion became a national legend. Newspapers described their ordeal in vivid detail. Soldiers surrounded for days, refusing to surrender, and rescued only after a brave pigeon carried their call for help. Major Whittlesey and several of his officers received the Medal of Honor for their leadership and endurance. The battalion's story was later adapted into films, books, and military histories. Yet, as historians examined the records, they found that the details of Cher Ami's exact flight, the timing, distance, and specific wording of the message differ slightly between sources. Some early war reports didn't link her directly to the Lost Battalion. Others credited different pigeons for earlier messages that also helped locate the men. Still, the Smithsonian's curators emphasize that there is no doubt she carried at least one critical message while wounded and that she was officially recognized for it by the U.S. Army. Even if some parts of the legend became simplified over time, the heart of the story, her courage, and the impact she had, remains absolutely true. Cher Ami's legacy outlasted the war by generations. For soldiers, she represented the bond between human and animal in wartime, a reminder that courage can come from the smallest of creatures. For children learning about the war in the decades after, she was an example of determination and hope. In the Smithsonian, her glass case became a quiet place of reflection. Veterans who had fought in the Argonne visited her display. Families of the 77th Division came to pay respect to the bird that helped their fathers and grandfathers make it home. She inspired poems, songs, and even a short 1930s musical performance at Carnegie Hall titled Cher Ami and the Lost Battalion. In World War II, U.S. Army pigeon handlers continued to tell her story to new recruits as an example of what a single bird could do in combat. More than a century later, Cher Ami remains one of the most famous animals in military history. Her name is often mentioned alongside other heroic wartime animals, such as Stubby the dog and Reckless the warhorse. Every year, historians and museums recount her flight when telling the story of communication and survival in the First World War. The U.S. Army Signal Corps commemorates her in publications and exhibits, emphasizing how pigeons served in more than 400 missions during the war, often saving entire units. And even though the precise details of that October day may be partly lost to time, the impact of her story continues. She represents the human desire to find hope and courage in even the smallest beings. When visitors walk through the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and stop in front of the preserved form of Cher Ami, they're often struck by how small she really is, barely larger than an average pigeon, feathers faded by time. Yet that small bird once carried the fate of hundreds on her fragile wings. The story of Cher Ami is not just about a bird. It's about perseverance under impossible odds. It's about courage that doesn't depend on strength or weapons, but on will. In the mud of the Argonne, surrounded by fear and death, a wounded bird took to the air because someone trusted her to do what no machine could. That trust was rewarded with survival. Today, as technology has advanced far beyond anything soldiers could imagine in 1918, her story reminds us of something simple. Even in an age of steel and fire, sometimes It's the softest wings that carry the heaviest message. Cher Ami, dear friend, a name that still echoes more than 100 years later.